Elijah sat by the window, tapping his pencil on the desk in a soft rhythm. It wasn't nerves. It was just a habit, something his mother always told him to stop. But it helped him think, so he kept doing it. Around him, the classroom buzzed with noise, kids whispering and laughing as they waited for the lesson to start. He kept his eyes on his notebook, quietly working, like he always did. He liked staying focused. It was easier that way. Most of the time, he felt invisible here. His teacher, Miss Thornton, almost never called on him. When he raised his hand, she looked past him. When he got something right, she moved on quickly. When he slipped up, she lingered just a little too long, Elijah noticed. Everyone noticed, so when her voice suddenly cut through the chatter that morning, sharp and direct, it caught him off guard. "Elijah," she said. The sound of his name made his head snap up. Dozens of eyes turned toward him. For a second, he thought he had misheard. She never called him. "Elijah, why don't you answer this one?" she pressed, pointing to the board. His heart kicked once, strong but steady. He sat up straighter, looking at the question. General Sherman's March to the Sea. He knew this. He took a slow breath and answered clearly. It was a military campaign designed to break the Confederacy's resources and morale. A pause. Then, almost too quietly, she said, "Not bad." The class shifted in their seats, whispering, surprised. Tyler, the boy sitting next to him, gave him a look that said, "What was that about?" Elijah didn't know. He only knew one thing. Something was different today. And from the way Miss Thornton's eyes lingered on him, he felt it in his chest. She wasn't finished with him. She had something bigger in mind. The bell rang and the students rushed out like they always did. Backpacks swung, chairs scraped, voices filled the hallway. Elijah moved slower, sliding his notebook into his bag. He was about to leave when he heard her voice again. "Elijah, stay for a moment." It wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to make a few kids at the door pause. They glanced back, whispering to each other before slipping into the hallway. Now it was just him, the teacher, and the faint echo of footsteps fading away. Miss Thornton sat down at her desk, folding her hands neatly on top of her notes. Her eyes locked on him with a calmness that didn't feel calm at all. It felt sharp, like she already had a plan. "I overheard you the other day," she began, tapping her fingers lightly on the desk. "Something about your grandfather." Elijah frowned. "What about him?" "You said he was a musician." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, he played piano. Jazz mostly." Her lips curved, but it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was thin, almost amused. "Interesting," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Then you must have picked up a thing or two." Elijah hesitated. He didn't like where this was going. "A little," he admitted carefully. "That's good to know," she said, her eyes flicking toward the back corner of the room. Elijah followed her gaze. There, half hidden under a dusty sheet, sat the old upright piano that had been ignored for years. His stomach tightened. "Tomorrow," she continued, "you'll play something for the class." For a second, Elijah thought he had misheard again. "What?" "The piano," she said simply. "You'll show us what you can do." He felt the air in the room grow heavier. This wasn't an invitation. It was a challenge. Her tone made it clear. This wasn't about music, it was about something else. "Why me?" he asked quietly. Her head tilted, eyes gleaming like she had been waiting for the question. "Why not? You said your grandfather played. I'm sure you have some of that talent in you." But Elijah knew better. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't encouragement. It was a setup. She expected him to stumble, to press the wrong keys, to make a fool of himself in front of everyone. He felt his throat tighten, but he kept his face calm. "All right," he said finally. She raised an eyebrow as if surprised by his steady tone, then waved her hand dismissively. "That will be all. You can go." Elijah slung his bag over his shoulder and walked toward the door. The hallway outside was quiet now, but his chest felt heavy, like the weight of tomorrow was already pressing down on him. As he stepped into the corridor, he caught sight of Tyler waiting by the lockers. "What did she want?" his friend asked. Elijah hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing," he muttered. But deep down he knew it was anything but nothing. Tomorrow she wanted him on that piano, and she wanted him to fail. That night Elijah lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The shadows from the streetlight stretched across his room, flickering every time a car passed outside. He should have been asleep, but his mind refused to rest. The teacher's words replayed over and over in his head. Tomorrow you'll play something for the class. He turned to his side, then to the other, pulling the blanket up to his chin. It wasn't just about the piano. He knew that. This wasn't a chance to shine. It was a trap. Miss Thornton wanted to see him stumble. She wanted the class to laugh, to prove whatever silent judgment she had about him was true. Elijah clenched his fists against the pillow. The thought of standing there with everyone watching filled him with a strange mix of dread and defiance. He didn't want to give her that satisfaction. He couldn't. From the corner of his room, his grandfather's old picture sat on the dresser. Elijah's eyes drifted toward it in the dim light. The frame was small, edges chipped from years of use, but the smile on his grandfather's face was as strong as ever. He could almost hear his voice, warm and steady, reminding him of the afternoons they spent together at the piano. Music is more than notes, Elijah. His grandfather had always said, it's a story. If you believe in the story, the people will believe in you. The memory stirred something inside him. Slowly, Elijah sat up, his bare feet pressing against the cool floor. He walked quietly into the living room where the upright piano stood against the wall, polished but worn with age. His mother had kept it after his grandfather passed. Elijah sat down on the wooden bench, his fingers brushing the keys. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He pressed one key, then another. The sound was gentle, familiar, like an old friend calling his name. At first, he played quietly, almost afraid of waking his mother. Simple notes, simple chords. But as the minutes passed, the music began to flow more freely. He let his hands wander, shifting into the songs his grandfather taught him, the ones filled with bluesy soul and quiet strength. For a while, the weight in his chest eased. The music carried him somewhere else, far away from the classroom, far away from Miss Thornton's cold stare. But when he stopped, the silence returned, heavier than before. He placed his hands on his lap and looked down. Tomorrow he wouldn't be in his living room. He wouldn't have the comfort of playing just for himself. Tomorrow the whole class would be watching, waiting, expecting him to fall. He stayed on that bench for almost an hour, repeating runs, drilling his fingers across the keys until his eyelids grew heavy. Finally, he stood, letting out a long breath. Before heading back to his room, he whispered to the picture of his grandfather on the wall, "I won't let her break me. Not tomorrow." When Elijah finally lay down again, sleep came slowly, filled with dreams of keys that slipped away under his fingers, of laughter echoing in the classroom. But beneath it all was something stronger, a spark of determination. Because deep inside, he knew tomorrow wasn't just about playing the piano. It was about proving himself, not just to his teacher, not just to his classmates, but to himself. The next morning, Elijah walked into Jefferson Middle School with his bag slung over his shoulder. The air in the hallways felt heavier than usual, like the walls themselves already knew what was coming. He kept his eyes down as he made his way to class, but whispers still reached him. "You gonna play today?" one boy muttered as Elijah passed. Another kid smirked. "Bet he can't even play Twinkle, Twinkle." Elijah said nothing. He just kept walking, his steps slow but steady. Inside, though, his stomach churned. The story had spread faster than he thought. Half the school probably knew by now. When he walked into the classroom, the piano in the corner felt different. It wasn't just an old piece of furniture anymore. It felt alive, waiting for him, daring him. The chipped keys glinted under the fluorescent light, and Elijah's chest tightened at the sight of it. Tyler leaned over from his desk and whispered, "Bro, is this for real?" "You're actually playing?" Elijah kept his voice low. "Looks like it." Tyler shook his head, eyes wide with worry. "She's setting you up, man." Elijah gave a small nod. "I know." Miss Thornton entered just then, her heels clicking against the floor. She carried herself like she always did, calm, composed, untouchable. But Elijah noticed the faint curve at the corner of her lips, the kind that wasn't a smile but more of a quiet victory. She barely glanced at the students settling in. Her eyes went straight to Elijah and then briefly to the piano. The lesson started like any other. She talked about history, scribbled notes on the board, called on the usual students, but Elijah barely heard her words. Every tick of the clock pulled him closer to the moment he'd been dreading. His pencil tapped against his notebook, faster this time, not out of habit, but to steady himself. When the clock hands inched toward the final minutes of class, she closed her book with a soft snap. The sound echoed in the quiet room. "Well," she said smoothly, "we seem to have a little extra time before the bell." Heads turned instantly. Eyes darted toward Elijah, then toward the piano. The energy in the room shifted, the kind of shift that happens right before a storm. "Perfect," Miss Thornton continued, her gaze sharp now. "Elijah, let's see what you can do." A ripple of whispers spread across the room. Some kids smirked, ready for a show. Others leaned forward, curious. Tyler muttered, "Man, you don't have to do this." But Elijah knew there was no backing out. He felt every eye following him as he pushed back his chair. The legs scraped against the floor, the sound making the silence feel even louder. He stood, steady on the outside, though his heart pressed hard against his chest. The walk to the piano felt longer than it should have. Each step seemed to echo through the room. He heard a quiet laugh behind him, a snicker from Brandon, one of the louder kids in the back. Elijah didn't turn around. When he reached the piano, he paused for a moment. It was old, worn, with keys yellowed by time and corners chipped from use. Dust lingered in the spaces between them. It didn't look like much, but to Elijah it was still a piano, and that was enough. Miss Thornton clasped her hands together at her desk, her eyes locked on him. "Play whatever you like," she said. Elijah rested his fingers gently on the keys. They felt stiff, different from the warm, polished piano at home, but he didn't flinch. He took one deep breath and let the room settle. Behind him the whispers faded. Dozens of eyes watched, waiting for him to fail. Some expected him to freeze, others were eager to laugh. But Elijah had already decided. He wasn't playing for them. He wasn't playing for her. He was playing for himself and for his grandfather. The silence grew thick, stretching longer and longer until finally he pressed the first note. Elijah sat at the piano, the cool keys resting under his fingertips. The classroom was so quiet he could hear his own breath. He could feel the eyes of every student on his back, feel Miss Thornton's stare like a weight pressing down. For a moment, doubt flickered inside him. He imagined hitting the wrong note, imagined the laughter that would follow, imagined her satisfied look. But then, like a steady voice from the past, he heard his grandfather's words in his mind. "Music is a story. If you believe in it, the world will listen." So he pressed the first key. The sound was soft, uneven at first, the piano slightly out of tune. A few kids snickered quietly, expecting a disaster. But then Elijah found the rhythm. His left hand set the pace, a slow rolling bass line, while his right hand began to dance across the keys. The sound grew fuller, richer, filling the room with something none of them expected. It was blues, it was jazz, it was soul. It was the sound of afternoons with his grandfather, of laughter, of love, of long summer days spent learning how to make a piano sing. The snickers stopped. The room leaned in. The smirks faded into silence. Elijah didn't look up. He wasn't playing for their approval. He was playing because the music inside him demanded to be heard. Each note carried weight, each chord stretched across the room like a story no words could tell. His fingers moved with confidence, weaving melodies and harmonies as if the piano wasn't old and broken but alive. Breathing with him, Miss Thornton's arms, once folded with quiet superiority, shifted slightly. Her brows drew together. She had expected clumsy notes, maybe a shaky rhythm. What she heard instead unsettled her. The melody grew bolder. Elijah's hands flew faster, sliding into runs his grandfather had drilled into him when he was only a boy. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. His heart was in every strike, every pause, every swell of sound. The classroom transformed. The walls that had always felt heavy with judgment now seemed to echo with warmth. Tyler sat forward in his seat, eyes wide. Brandon, who had been ready to laugh, leaned back with his arms crossed, but his smirk was gone. Madison in the back stared as though she had forgotten to blink. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, letting the music guide him. The longer he played, the more the world outside faded. It wasn't about the teacher anymore. It wasn't about proving himself to the kids who doubted him. It was about telling a story, his story, through every note. Then came the part he always saved for himself, the one his grandfather had told him was too difficult when he first learned it. Elijah's hands climbed the keys one after another, building to a run that demanded both speed and precision. He went for it anyway. His heart pounded as the notes cascaded like water rushing over stones, tumbling into a swell that filled every corner of the room. The silence grew deeper, heavier, The kind of silence that doesn't come from boredom but from awe. And then he slowed, easing into the final chords. The sound softened, gentle, like the closing of a door after a long journey. The last note lingered, trembling in the air before fading into stillness. Elijah lifted his hands and placed them on his lap. He didn't move. He didn't speak. For the first time since he sat down, he let himself breathe. No one clapped at first. No one whispered. The classroom was frozen, as though every student and even the teacher had been pulled into the music and were only now remembering where they were. Then, from the back of the room came a single clap, sharp, echoing. It broke the silence. Another clap followed. Then another. Within seconds, the entire class was applauding, some even whistling, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Elijah didn't smile. He didn't bow. He simply sat there, calm, steady, while the sound of their applause washed over him. Because this wasn't about applause. It was about being heard. And finally, he had been. The last note still seemed to float in the air even after Elijah's hands had left the keys. For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still. No one shuffled. No one whispered. It was as if every student had forgotten how to breathe. Then slowly the spell broke. One clap from the back, another from the front, and soon the sound grew, rolling through the classroom like a wave. Applause filled the room, echoing off the walls. Some kids cheered, others whistled, and even those who had doubted him now sat wide-eyed, shaking their heads as if they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Tyler let out a low whistle. "Man, that was insane," he muttered, but his voice carried enough for half the room to hear. Brandon, who had smirked earlier, crossed his arms and muttered under his breath, but there was no laughter in him now, only disbelief. Madison in the back leaned forward, her chin resting on her hand, staring at Elijah like she was seeing him for the first time. Elijah didn't smile. He didn't move. He sat there with his hands resting on his lap, calm, steady as the clapping grew louder. This wasn't about showing off. It wasn't about entertaining them. It was about proving something to himself, that he belonged, that his voice mattered, even if it came through music. But not everyone clapped. Miss Thornton stood at the front of the room, arms folded tightly across her chest. Her face, usually so composed, betrayed something different now. Her lips pressed thin. Her eyes, once sharp and confident, flickered with something harder to read. Confusion, maybe frustration, maybe even fear. She hadn't expected this. She had set a trap, and Elijah had turned it into a stage. The students noticed. A few glanced at her, waiting for her to say something. But she stayed silent, her jaw tight. Finally, Elijah stood from the bench. The applause still carried on, but his focus was on her. He didn't gloat. He didn't look for approval. He just met her gaze, calm and unflinching. Miss Thornton cleared her throat, finally breaking the moment. "Well," she said, her voice clipped. "That was unexpected." The clapping slowed, confusion spreading across the room. That was all she had to say, after what they had just witnessed. A murmur rose from the back. Brandon, bold as ever, leaned forward in his chair. "That's it?" he asked. "He plays like someone off TV, and all you've got is unexpected." A ripple of agreement moved through the class. A few kids nodded. Others whispered. The usual order of the room felt different now. Miss Thornton's eyes snapped toward Brandon. "This is a classroom, not a talent show," she said firmly. But her voice, though sharp, didn't carry the same authority as before. It sounded thinner, like she was struggling to hold on to her usual control. Elijah spoke up before the room fell silent again. His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. "You didn't think I could play. That's why you asked me." The class shifted, the tension thickening once more. A few students exchanged wide-eyed glances. Someone whispered, "He's right." Miss Thornton's lips tightened. "That's enough, Elijah," but he didn't stop. He looked her straight in the eye. "You wouldn't have asked Tyler. You wouldn't have asked Madison. You asked me because you thought I'd fail." The whispers grew. Some kids leaned closer, caught between shock and admiration. Elijah's calm words carried more weight than any shout ever could. Miss Thornton's face stiffened. "Sit down," she ordered, but there was no power behind it, not the kind she usually had. The class could feel it. For the first time, the control she always held over the room had cracked. Elijah didn't move right away. He glanced at his classmates, kids who had overlooked him, doubted him, dismissed him. He saw the way they were looking at him now, Not as invisible, not as weak, but as someone who had done something none of them could ignore. Finally, he walked back to his seat. Every step felt heavy, but not with fear. With freedom. With victory. Tyler gave him a small nod as he sat down, the kind of nod that said more than words. Elijah didn't need applause anymore. He didn't need Miss Thornton's approval. He had already changed something. The energy in the room proved it, and Miss Thornton knew it too. The bell rang at last, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the classroom. Chairs scraped, backpacks zipped, and students filed out with a buzz of energy that wasn't there at the start of the day. They weren't just talking about homework anymore. They were talking about Elijah. Did you hear him? Man, I didn't know he could do that. That was crazy, like something from a movie. The voices trailed into the hallway, but Elijah moved slowly, his bag slung over his shoulder. He reached the door almost free when he heard her voice again. Elijah. He paused, turning back. Miss Thornton stood by her desk, her arms no longer folded. For a moment, she looked like she might say something real, something honest, but then her expression hardened again. I hope you understand, she said carefully. This is still my classroom. Elijah held her gaze. He didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He just said, calm and steady, I know. Then he walked out. The hallway buzzed with life, but it felt different now. Tyler caught up to him, his grin wide. Bro, you just flipped the whole world upside down. You gotta play again sometime. Elijah only shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. Maybe I will. That afternoon, he walked home with a lightness in his step. The sun dipped low over West Markham Street, stretching long golden shadows across the sidewalk. He stopped at the corner store for a drink, and old Mr. Henson, the shop owner, studied him with curious eyes. You look like a boy who just did something important, the man said with a knowing smile. Elijah hesitated, then nodded. Maybe I did. When he reached home, the smell of fried catfish and cornbread drifted through the kitchen. His mother was at the stove, humming softly as she cooked. You're home late, she said, not turning from the pan. Yeah, Elijah replied, dropping his bag by the door and sitting at the table. Long day. She glanced over her shoulder, catching the look on his face. Good long or bad long? Elijah thought about it. About the silence in the classroom when he played. About the clapping. About the way Miss Thornton had looked at him. Unsettled, unsure. About the way his classmates finally saw him. Good, he said finally. Really good. His mother turned off the stove and sat across from him, her eyes soft, curious. You want to tell me about it? So he did. For 15 minutes, Elijah told her everything. How the teacher had called on him, how she had challenged him to play, how the class had watched, and how he had played anyway. He didn't leave anything out. She listened quietly, not interrupting, her expression shifting between concern, pride, and something deeper, almost sadness. When he finished, she reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Sounds like you made her uncomfortable, she said gently. Elijah gave a small nod. I think I did. And how do you feel about that? She asked. He thought for a moment, then answered with certainty. Like it was supposed to happen. Her smile spread slowly, proud and warm. Good, she said. Because sometimes the best lessons are the ones you don't find in books. The next day at school, things weren't the same. Not completely. Miss Thornton still acted like nothing had happened. She still called on the same students, still carried herself with her usual authority. But the class didn't see her the same way. Her control wasn't as solid anymore. It was thinner, fragile, like glass with a crack running through it. And Elijah, he wasn't invisible anymore. At lunch, students who had never spoken to him before came over. Dude, that was amazing. How long you been playing? Madison asked, sliding into the seat across from him. Tyler grinned and clapped him on the shoulder. Man, you've been holding out on us. Elijah smirked. Guess so. From across the cafeteria, Miss Thornton walked by with her lunch tray. For a second, their eyes met. This time it was she who looked away first. Elijah kept eating, calm and steady. Because he didn't need her recognition. He didn't need her approval. He had already proved what he needed to prove. Some stories aren't written on chalkboards or found in textbooks. Some stories are played out in moments that change everything. Elijah had faced doubt, silence, and judgment. But when the moment came, he let his talent speak louder than all of it. And when you let your gift rise higher than their doubts, there's nothing they can do but listen